Welcome to The Details with Adam Froer and Cecil Walker. This is a podcast where we examine the intersection between solution-focused brief therapy and the current topics happening in the world. And we do this because we genuinely want the world to be a better place. So enjoy and come examine the details with us. So today we're going to be talking about a topic that's influencing us at this particular moment. Hurricane Ian has hit Florida and is currently a bit farther north. And I think there's a bit of gratitude for us in Georgia that it kind of skipped around us. But I think at the same time, right, there's like, as with many natural disasters, as with many crises, there's this kind of mixture of feelings of a relief on our own part because we were spared this experience, but then also kind of concern and an outreach of care for those who were not spared from this experience. And so we're going to be walking through some of the details. And one of the things I think, Cecil, and you can chime in too, is we're going to kind of be talking about the hurricane as a crisis. And this obviously is a physical crisis, but I think we're going to be making some comparisons to mental health crises. And so there's going to be a bit of an analogy that we use throughout this process. And I think there's going to be some interesting parallels between this physical crisis that's happening and maybe some mental health crises that people experience on a regular basis.
Yeah, I think that's a helpful depiction to construct in this conversation is the comparison here between this natural disaster crisis and mental health crises. I think you could even apply that to national trends in general, right? There are more and more powerful and intense natural disasters happening in the US. And also there's more and more mental health problems and intensity of those problems in the US as well. So I think there's plenty here to dive into in terms of how do we approach those things? How do we deal with those? And the very first thing that comes to mind is that we should probably be engaging in a conversation that speaks to how do we live with the continuous understanding of how we can deal with crises when they show up, rather than just trying to jump from fire to fire and put those out when they catch us off guard. And I would say the same applies to our mental health fires that might pop up too.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that obviously there are some natural disasters and there are some mental health crises that seem to come out of nowhere, right? I think maybe earthquakes are a good example of that we don't really have a lot of advanced warning when that's going to happen. Hurricanes are a bit different, where we can kind of see them growing in intensity kind of far away and we can predict the path that they're going to take. But I think that holds true for mental illness crises as well, that some of them just kind of seem to spontaneously appear, while others we can see a building in intensity in what's going on. But I think regardless of the origin of those things, I think one of the things that's really valuable is to have a preventative approach rather than a reactive approach. Obviously,
Right.
We're going to need to react, but if we can do things to be prepared in beforehand, that's probably a better approach, right? So if we, in the case of natural disasters, if we potentially gathered food, or we came up with an evacuation plan, or if possible, we, stored a bit of money in case we needed to evacuate, or those kinds of things, that would obviously help us to be able to react better to situations than if we didn't make any preparations at all. And I think similarly with mental illness, there are things that we can do that can help prepare us for those times. And a lot of those things are just basic fundamental things like eating a healthy diet, getting a lot of sleep that's consistent, exercising really routinely, and taking care of those, what we oftentimes think of as basic fundamental physical needs. Those are actually really fundamental mental health needs as well. And so I think in addition to those kind of fundamental things, one of the things that I think is also important, and I think you and I, as trained marriage and family therapists, relationships, I think, really impact mental health. And so preventatively, if there are, relationships that aren't working that well for us, either trying to work on or repair those relationships, or letting those problematic relationships kind of go by the wayside and say, this isn't good for me in the long run. But also, in addition to that, surrounding yourself with people who are kind and who are supportive and who are looking out for your well-being and checking in with you periodically. So there are things that we can do as a preventative measure that can really shore up our mental health and potentially protect us from mental health crises, or it becomes a network or something, resources that we can fall back on in moments of trial or crisis.
Yeah. I the more we talk about this, the more I really like this depiction of this analogy between the two, because innately in its name, in a natural disaster, this is a naturally occurring thing. Obviously, there's a huge conversation we could talk about how contributions to climate change have intensified recent natural disasters. But in general, no one is trying to deny the reality of the existence of these disasters. No one's trying to say that there is something unnatural about this. No one's feeling shameful or taking blame or giving blame for the existence of natural disasters. They're just naturally occurring things. And we generally seem to accept that they happen and we have to do something in response to them. And I think if we took that same approach to mental health things, this doesn't mean a flaw in someone's character. This doesn't mean someone's totally to blame for this or something like that. But what it does mean is that we have to build ourselves up and prepare in the right ways, like you're saying, to have a strategy, to have an understanding that allows us to deal with those things when they do show up. And that takes quite an amount of awareness, self-awareness, situational awareness, knowing what helps you in times of need, like you're saying, things that balance you out and put you on track, like eating well and sleeping well and having the social connections that you need. In places like Florida, they have things that you wouldn't have in places where hurricanes don't happen, right? They have hurricane insurance and they have, all these things to help with flooding. They build their houses in certain kinds of ways. The plant life that lives in Florida is extraordinarily flexible because it's used to being bent by the wind. And so the things that are in place where hurricanes happen have adapted to how do we live even though hurricanes may come up. And I think we have to kind of live our lives in the same kind of way, right? We can't deny or try to refute that there will be those difficulties that pop up. You might have moments where you feel depressed. You might have moments where you feel anxious. As much as we want to rip those things away from us or totally block out our expectation of those things from our future, I think it'd be much more constructive to build a house that could deal with the existence of those things if they should show up or when they should show up, just like you would build your house in a way that it can withstand being in a state where natural disasters happen to it.
Yeah, I think that's a really beautiful analogy. And I think one of the things too that it makes me think of is that as we consider now kind of the aftermath of this natural disaster, and obviously it's an ongoing thing at this moment, but at some point we're going to have to deal with the aftermath. I think oftentimes one of the things that happens is that we start to point the fingers or we place judgment on how people responded to this natural disaster. And I think similarly, like you made the connection, both of these things are naturally occurring things, whether it's a natural disaster or whether it's mental health concerns. And in both of those instances, as onlookers, there can be a tendency to place judgment or to say, if you had just done such and such, or if you would access such and such a resource, you would, right? So
Right.
As onlookers, there's a tendency to place judgment.
Right.
And in natural disasters, we can judge like, you overreacted and got out too soon, or you didn't heed the counsel of people who knew better, and so you stayed behind. And so there's all of these places where we can put judgment on what people choose to do.
Right.
And I think one of the important things in mental health and in these instances is there needs to be a real valuing of each individual and their autonomy.
Right.
We have to look at them and say, we don't know why someone decided to stay behind. Maybe it's a single mom who, is working a couple of jobs. And when they say evacuate, she thinks to herself, I don't have the money, or my car won't make a trip that would get us that far away, or I don't have enough money to pay for gas for that journey. And so if I don't have an option except for to stay here and hunker down and hope for the best. Or potentially, somebody comes from a really loving, caring place and says, maybe I have an aged parent who I just don't think will be able to make that journey, but I don't want to leave them here alone. And so I'll do everything I can to make them as safe as possible in this place, knowing that there's risk. And again, I think it isn't appropriate for us as onlookers to look at people and to judge why they made the decisions they made. We don't know the context that might made that the right decision. And I think similarly with mental health, sometimes when people experience a trauma, right, like a sexual assault or something, we look at them and we say, well, if you hadn't been in that place, or if you hadn't been drinking in that way, and so we place judgment on, if you hadn't been doing those things, this wouldn't have happened. Or, somebody who has depression, we might look at them and we might say, if you associated with people who were good or kind, or if you would just stop being so lazy and get out of bed and do those things, right? So there's all of these opportunities for us to pass judgment, but we don't know the context of what contributed to that person doing what they did or behaving in the way they do. And so I think in some sense, one of the kindest things we could do, and in one of the things that we could do to bolster resilience and mental health and those kinds of things, is to say, I'm going to give you every benefit of the doubt. And in some sense, instead of even passing any kind of judgment, I offer sympathy, or I offer empathy, or I offer compassion instead. And if we started reacting to each other with compassion rather than judgment, these crises and how we recover from these crises could be infinitely different in both of these instances.
Right. Yeah, I think that's one of the most useful traits we can have as clinicians. I certainly think that, individuals among themselves, their peers, their family members should carry that same kind of sense too. But when we use that as clinicians, that's an extremely supplemental thing to the healing that happens for clients, is to be able to allow a space where there is an understanding that there can be reason and value to your decision making with the autonomy that you make it with, that someone else can respect and understand that you are doing the best that you can, that you are taking in the variables that are relevant to you and making the decisions that you need to make. It's given that some things are hard and some things are influential and some things are pushing you in certain directions. I think you came to Atlanta in 2016, so 2015. For a long while, large population in Atlanta was transplants from Hurricane Katrina. I don't know if you bumped into that at all. I think that recognition, it kind of died down a bit by that point. But for a long while, almost everywhere you went, everyone knew people, families who had gotten up and moved from Louisiana or somewhere along the Gulf Coast that was affected and resettled in Atlanta. And that was very noticeable because culture of Louisiana is very distinct. For the most part, people don't really leave Louisiana. And so to make that decision, I could very well see how some people chose to stay and some people chose to leave. Obviously, for safety's sake, you would try to get out of harm's way, but it's so connected there. So many people have such deep roots there that when you leave, you're cutting a lifeline almost. You're starting completely over. You are now in this totally different place with almost nothing in terms of community and identity and culture and things like that. And so I think that's a brilliant example of how could you possibly make a judgment call on how someone should have decided to which way they should have gone with how they respond to that kind of a situation. And I think the exact same applies to mental health matters too.
Yeah, and it makes me think of a question. And obviously you and I do solution-focused therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that we talk about quite a bit is that when you're engaged in a solution-focused conversation, one of the things that's really powerful is that we're looking at where we would like to go or how we would like to be. And we start to describe the difference that would make. And I'm wondering if we started looking at mental health in this, it's a naturally occurring thing. It's something that deserves, valuing people's autonomy. It's an experience where we should be giving people compassion rather than judgment. If we approached mental illness in this way, what difference do you think that would make overall?
I think some of the first things we would notice is that it would be easier to have conversations about mental health problems in a very general public sense, in a person-to-person sense, in a confessional of my own mental health issues sense. If it felt like this was something that was infused with autonomy, something that people were regularly making, like we said earlier, building strategies for how do we respond to mental health things, recognizing it as a naturally occurring thing. If all that happened, then it would be no problem at all to talk about that stuff openly, to be able to say from one person to another, whether you know them well or not, here's what I'm dealing with, or here's what you could do to help with the things it seems like you're dealing with. Because I know that those conversations in every space isn't as easy to have. In some spaces, it's actually very hard to have.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And I think as you were talking, one of the things that came to my mind as well is that if we just were open with our communication, if we viewed mental health as something that's just natural, it's part of
Right.
One of the ways I guess that I would say it is, it's part of the human experience,
Exactly.
right? So instead of thinking about mental health as a problem, we would just think about it as part of what people deal with, part of what we have. Days that are easier, we have days that are harder, and mental health contributes probably to both of those. There are some days where mental health contributes to things being harder. There are some days where mental health might contribute to things being a bit easier. It would be less of a pathology,
Right.
and it would be more of, oh, this is just your human experience. And so I think there would be an openness that would make it, like you said, easier just to talk about and say, I'm having this kind of a day today. And it would also help. The other thing I think that would really be beneficial if we viewed it in this way is that we wouldn't view mental health simply as negative, right? That it's maladaptive or that it's impacting us poorly. But we might say, in some sense, what are you learning as you go through this experience is similar in this preparation, right? Hurricanes come to Florida or to the Gulf Coast over and over and over. And each time, it's a learning opportunity to say, okay, where can we strengthen our infrastructure? How can we work on the evacuation plan a bit better? How do we support people who are in need a bit more? And I think similarly, if we viewed mental health in this way, one of the differences would be we would look at what are the things that we're learning as we go through these experiences that will help prepare us when this inevitably comes again, or helps us to prevent this from getting as bad as it did this time. And so I think just viewing it as part of the human experience really would help us manage, prevent, and be resilient much, much more than we are now.
Yeah, I think this applies to any topic really, where for whatever reason, the nature of the topic itself presents conversation around it. The strategies around that then now suffer. And so if this were to be approached in these ways that we're talking about, similar to natural disaster, then we could have more of a reasonable response. We could have a landscape where people don't have unnecessary suffering with these things, where we could respond to them when they naturally occur in a way that actually is more appropriate and allows people to feel like, this is a reasonable thing to bring up and to start to do something about.
I guess that's the other question then is, if we started looking at this differently, and if we started to notice the changes or the impact that it would have if we looked at it like this, I guess it kind of begs the question of like, what would it then mean about us as a people or about how we manage mental health? What thoughts do you have about that around, like, if we could make this transition, what would that mean?
The deeper into this we go, the more I could talk all day long about it. So I think we're trying to get into dangerous territory if we want this to end sometime today. I think that begins to mean quite a lot potentially. To be able to accept this as a part of the human experience, I feel like we struggle with that kind of a thing in general. We like to categorize people and dismiss people and push people and problems to the side and say, you're that kind of a person, or you come from that kind of a place, or you're this category of a thing if you're dealing with this or doing those things or experiencing this kind of thing. I think the same applies to addiction. Once someone is an addict, it's so easy to dismiss them and say, you're this kind of a person, and here's the kind of life that kind of person has. Here's the kind of jobs that you should be allowed to have for the rest of your life. Here's the kind of social life that you can have. And it separates people out, and we kind of draw these boundaries, which I think are quite imaginary, where we say that that's a different kind of person. I could never be that kind of a person. But when we start to acknowledge maybe some of this is actually just a part of the spectrum of the human experience. And somehow, for one reason or several reasons, someone is falling on a very extreme end of the spectrum, or more intense end than I've personally experienced. But if we start to really embrace this as these are facets of the human experience, we can help everyone by beginning to embrace it in that way and having open conversations about it. And maybe even foster a bit more empathy to be able to say that there's a part of me that's in you and there's a part of you that's in me. I've never been addicted to heroin, but I can look at a heroin addict or someone previously addicted to heroin and say that, what factors could have led me to be even further along on the spectrum to where I was experiencing that for some reason. How do we make sure that no one has to suffer in that kind of a way and deal with this in a really open and human kind of a way?
Yeah, I think that's really beautiful that in some sense, if we took this preventative care, if we changed our perspective around like what it means to be experiencing a mental health crisis in this way, I think what it does is it makes us inherently look at the person as a person.
Right.
And we take in that context, right? And we say, just like we might with a natural disaster, we look at the single mother and we say, how could we help a single mother in a situation where disaster is looming? And in some sense, if we looked at each person as human, it knits us together, it pulls us together, we're supportive of each other, we're looking out for each other. I think we have the same opportunity with mental health where we would set up preventative measures, we would support each other, we would rally around each other in a totally different way. And I think it would lift all of us to a higher plane of behavior, that we would be interacting with each other from this place of love rather than a place of judgment or criticism or judgment, right? So I think that's a really beautiful sentiment.
Yeah. On that, a slight aside, but on that topic of pathology and categorizing, not to muddy the analogy that we built up over this whole conversation, but I read recently that, and this was totally irrelevant to Hurricane Ian. I just happened to be reading this because I have a strange addiction to nonfiction for some reason. But the way that we categorize hurricanes themselves are even a bit unjust. Apparently that 5 category system, a Hurricane 3, Hurricane Category 4, whatever, that system was developed in the 70s by someone a bit arbitrarily. They based it off of how much destruction a hurricane would potentially do to a standard home in the area where that person lived, the person who developed it, the standard home in that area in the 70s. And so that's created wild deviations with these 5 categories now, because a low Category 4 could be totally wildly different than what other areas of Category 4 look like for modern day destruction that it could potentially have. And I think the same type of just categorization happens with people, like we were just talking about, with pathologies, with how we diagnose and how we categorize socially other people. We say that this line means a lot when it doesn't really mean that much at all.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think you're getting at, again, kind of the meaning here of we arbitrarily put meaning to what these various symptoms mean.
Mm-hmm.
And if we instead looked at each individual and we said, what do you as an individual need? How can we help you as an individual? Our level of care and our usefulness, I think, would drastically increase.
Absolutely.
That's good. Well, I think that's probably a beginning conversation around this topic. So thank you for engaging in this conversation. I think it's a really meaningful conversation. And for those of you who are listening, let us know what you think and let us know how you interpret our take on disasters or crises from mental health all the way to natural disasters.
This podcast is sponsored by the Solution Focused Universe, a global community dedicated to the growth of professionals who want to master the solution-focused approach. The SFU is home to the world's largest library of solution-focused material, which is updated on a monthly basis. Join fellow community members and solution-focused leaders in coaching calls and private Facebook groups to discuss anything and everything related to solution-focused brief therapy.